Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. I've got quite a few issues to talk about this evening. Now, we did have a guest lined up, but you'll never guess what happened when it comes to someone to debate. Remember, I described Scotland as the debate desert. Well, sometimes on YouTube or on Facebook, if someone's making comments disagreeing with content in a video, if they're sounding like, reasonably sensible, then I might put a comment saying, how about coming on to the live stream to debate with me? And sometimes someone will say, oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'll possibly do that. So I'll send them an email address and Neil will communicate with them and we'll get them lined up to come on. But then almost every time they drop out at some point. So the guest we were intended to have tonight has dropped out. I say in the tradition of Scotland, sadly, it's very, very difficult to get people to come and discuss. Just to say to Bruce 5002, would you like to come on and discuss tonight? Because you make a lot of comments, you make a lot of sensible points. So Bruce, put a comment in. If you fancy coming on, I will put the link in and you can be on screen in just a minute. It'll be fascinating to talk to you. Right, Bruce, just while you're thinking about that offer, I'll talk about another few things in the news. Good Morning Scotland with Kay Adams, Radio Scotland's sort of chat program in the morning. Do you ever listen to it? I do occasionally when I'm driving. It's often excruciating. But someone alerted me to a discussion on it, I think it was yesterday morning actually, about assisted suicide, which of course we don't call assisted suicide anymore. They've now started to call it assisted dying. The previous bills in the Parliament were called assisted suicide, but they've obviously had a rebrand. They don't like the word suicide, so they're calling it assisted dying. So they were discussing that. That was the topic. And they had on Dr. Gordon MacDonald of the organisation Care Not Killing. Now, Dr. Gordon MacDonald is a very clever chap who would put over his arguments very clearly. But it was a classic story on the BBC. It's always the same when they're discussing assisted suicide. They have some people on with sad stories. Oh, my husband, my wife was like this, and it was very sad. And at the end, the presenter says, oh, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Oh, that was very brave. There are always people on the pro-assisted suicide. They'll say, oh, if only my husband could have committed suicide, that would have been wonderful. That was just what we wanted. Just what he wanted as well. And then, so they get thanks so much for sharing. That's really brave. We really appreciate you coming on the show. They'll probably be given 3 or 4 minutes to tell the story. Then they turn to the person who's going to make the case against assisted suicide, and they're just at them immediately, interrupting, hostile questions. Don't let them finish a sentence. That's exactly what happened to Dr. MacDonald. It was appalling. I mean, how anyone in the BBC would watch this and think, yeah, that was fine. Kay Adams did her job there. She was a neutral presenter. It's impossible to imagine anyone could watch that, listen to it rather, and think that she was being neutral. And the other thing that happens in these discussions is when people on the pro-assisted suicide or pro whatever the progressive issue is they're talking about, when they come out with statistics and facts, it's just, oh, well, that's interesting. Thanks very much for telling us that. We really appreciate your expertise. But then someone from the other side of the argument, when they put forward some facts, some statistics, some research, where's that from? Which journal is that from? When was it? Is that widely accepted? They're just constant skepticism, total double standard. But that's what we get. The other thing I would say about Good Morning Scotland, if you ever listen to it, quite often they'll discuss this sort of issue. And the discussion is always between some progressive development or the status quo. That's always the discussion. So it doesn't matter where the discussion ends up on the spectrum overall, it's moved along from the status quo in the progressive direction. They would never have a discussion between the status quo and moving in a socially conservative direction. That would never, ever be the topic. So it doesn't matter what the topic is, doesn't matter how the so-called debate goes, public opinion is shifted in the progressive direction. Anyway, that was the Good Morning Scotland. I've actually given up trying to get on the program. I used to get on sometimes, but you phone up and you get to someone and they say, oh, what are you going to say? So I would tell them what I was going to say. And it would often be, okay, right, thanks very much, goodbye. That'd be that. So I learned that when you're explaining what you're going to say, you have to keep it a bit vague don't be too specific. And then sometimes you can slip through the net and actually get onto the program. But the times I've got onto the program, I was just treated like Dr. McDonald, just total hostility from the moment Kay Adams realizes that you're on the wrong side, then you get the hostile treatment. But anyway, that's enough about Good Morning Scotland. Let's see if we've had a reply from Bruce. Oh no. Okay, you could come on without a webcam. If you've just got a microphone, you could do it. A microphone would be fine. But okay, let's have a look at some comments. Right, hello everyone. Lots of people saying hello. Hello, Fraser. Fraser, I hope you're feeling better. Fraser, you're on two things. You're on YouTube and Facebook. Oh, that's good. Right. Okay. Did the same on Scotland Tonight on the television. I assume that's about assisted suicide. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the BBC, assisted suicide is one of the issues where they are the most explicitly biased. Now, that's obviously difficult to select one to mention in particular because there's a whole range of issues where they're massively biased. But assisted suicide is one where they absolutely go overboard. So no pretense of neutrality at all. The cards on the shelf. Yeah, some of them have moved because we've got Christmas cards and things on the mantelpiece. So the ones on the top shelf are coming. I've decided that just to go off at a tangent with Bob just for a little while. I've decided to promote Max Verstappen to my shelf of fame here as well, to join the other four there. So you'll see him pop up after Christmas, all being well, if I can find one at the right price. Right, moving on. What else has been in the news? Right, so what do you think about this? I saw a video on Twitter from a Scottish primary school, and it had the pupils, that they were only maybe P1, I would say, very youngest primary school pupils, doing a fashion show in class. So they'd made this little catwalk out of mats, and they were dressing up in clothes. Basically, it was more or less only the girls that were doing it. So they put on various, dresses, frilly skirts and this, that, and the other, and were sort of parading themselves up and down the catwalk in model style poses. Well, there's only one boy taking part. So I assume most of the boys were not into this, but that's what the girls were doing. Well, what do you think about that? Put in the comments. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that's a sort of healthy activity for sort of P1 children, inducting them into the philosophy of a fashion show? I was sort of a bit unsure. What's anyone think about that? Type in. I know it takes a while for comments to come up, but type them in. I just thought, is that really the fashion shows, but at the very least, you might suggest that it's quite a shallow world. So it was basically girls taking part, so teaching the girls how to sort of parade themselves in front of people. I just wasn't sure about it. Right. Some other people are also unsure as well. It wasn't something where I felt, this is just sort of dead wrong, slam dunk, like getting boys to wear skirts or whatever. But I don't know. It didn't sit well with me. Let's put it that way. Right. Staying on the school subject, there's been quite a big story from schools this week. You've probably seen it in the media or on social media, at least. And that is this questionnaire being produced by the government to be used in all schools. Now, at last count, I think something like 12 of the 32 councils have rejected it. They basically said, we're not using it because of concerns from parents or the councillors themselves. And the issue is the part of the questionnaire that's designed for, I think it's like 15-year-olds upwards, maybe 14 upwards. There's a page of questions about the pupils' sex life, basically. And it goes into significant detail about what sexual practices they engage in, with whom, how often, and taking what precautions. Let's just leave it at that. Okay. So pretty detailed. And, we're talking about some, let's just say, unorthodox sexual practices as well, included in that. So this questionnaire has caused quite a stir. People have said, that it's outrageous for various reasons. It normalizes illegal underage sex. It gives the pupils the impression that the school just assumes or expects that they're engaging in these sort of sexual activities. It's just embarrassing for the pupils to be asked about that. What's going to be done with the information? as well. So a lot of very valid concerns about it. But the thing I found quite frustrating, extremely frustrating, is that this has ended up as a front page story on the Herald, and it's been in lots of other newspapers as well. Now, what happens with these sometimes, if it gets into the newspapers, they'll phone up the Conservatives and say, have you got any comment? Now, if you're the Conservatives and a newspaper phones up and says, would you like to criticize the SNP over this? Well, if the question is, would you like to criticize the SNP? Well, the answer is always yes, isn't it? So the Conservatives also say, oh yes, that's very inappropriate. Yeah, we don't approve. But they're not really interested. They won't actually campaign against this sort of thing. They won't be making any effort to get to the heart of the matter or to uncover the philosophy behind it. They'll just take the opportunity to criticize the SNP. So this story has been a headline story in Scotland. It was on the BBC website. But the frustrating thing is that this questionnaire is really a minor issue compared to the content of the government's sex education resources they've produced. I mean, what's more serious? Asking pupils, for example, have you had anal sex? How many times have you had anal sex in the last year or whatever? What's worse? Asking them that, or sitting them down in a lesson and saying, these are the sorts of sexual activity you can engage in. They're all equal. We're not discouraging or encouraging any of them. It's entirely up to you, including things like anal sex and what they call in their resources rimming, licking the anus. Sorry, I have to talk about these things, but this is what children are taught about in Scottish schools. So surely that lesson, the other thing it says, there's also a video in the curriculum that says basically that anal sex is probably more pleasurable than natural sexual intercourse. Okay, that's presented to the children. Okay, now that's obviously a far more serious issue than asking a question about it on a questionnaire, isn't it? It's far more serious. And yet, the media will not touch the sex education resources. It doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter what information we provide to them, they will not touch it. Even when we had a professional opinion poll done, which showed a majority of the Scottish population disapproving of elements of the SNP's sex education resources, media will not touch it, won't touch it. Not a single column inch anywhere. And I genuinely can't understand it. I can't understand it. I mean, is it because they just think it's come from the Scottish Family Party, so we have to ignore it? Is it that? Or is it that they think we don't want to be talking about sex education because it might be bad for our image? People might think we're a bit, too conservative, too old-fashioned, or whatever. Or maybe even, there's a big LGBT element in it, and a lot of it is led by the LGBT campaigners. That's why we've got the form of sex education that we've got. So maybe they feel they might be branded homophobic if they give any column inches to public opinion about these things. But I genuinely don't understand. I emailed the education editor at a newspaper today that had featured this story very prominently. I said, look, there's obviously public interest in these issues, but this is the tip of the iceberg. This is a much more serious issue. Sex education resources, a couple of bullet points, 2 or 3 bullet points. And I said, look, if you send me an address, I'll send you our book. It goes to all of you as well. If you want to read our book here, just email. We'll send one to you. And phone me up. I'll fill you in on the details. The man who's in charge of creating these sex education resources wrote in his PhD dissertation about the need to break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality. Okay, I mean, it's a news story. It's a serious issue, but they won't touch it. So if anyone's got any ideas why the media won't touch those things, then I would be fascinated to hear. Right, let's just do a bit of deleting from the sort of online sex show that's been promoted in the YouTube comments. I think we can do without that. Right, we just said goodbye to that. Yeah, so that's a frustration. That's been a frustration for years, that this is such a serious issue. So many people are concerned about it, and yet the media will not touch it. Sadly, I would say that is true. I mean, to be honest, to call a spade, these sex education resources are produced I won't go into details, but a lot of the people at the top of producing them are gay men. I mean, that's just a fact. Okay. And I think the LGBT philosophy infuses the whole lot of the educational resources. That's why different forms of sexual activity are all presented equally, because for them, that is an equality issue. To not do that would be a form of discrimination. So all forms of sexuality have to be presented as equal. In the same way that when they talk about, how do you make a baby, procreation, then all ways of creating a baby are presented equally. They're given equal billing. So there's natural sexual intercourse, but then there's other means as well involving donors, etc. But again, they would think it would be discriminatory to not take that approach. That would be homophobic, basically, because all forms are the same. Just while I'm on that topic, I was sent a link to a story just the other day about fertility treatment, where a couple ended up having more babies than they intended, and they were suing the NHS basically for producing more babies. I mean, this is madness. Another thing I've heard with that is currently to have fertility treatment, for example, IVF. A heterosexual couple, have to have been trying to have a child. I think it might be for a year, maybe. So they've been having unprotected sex with the intention of getting pregnant. It hasn't happened. After a year, then you can go forward and the NHS will pay for a certain amount of IVF treatment. Now, a lesbian couple, the rule for lesbians and for gay people, I think is roughly that you have to get a donor, but then with artificial insemination, try to get pregnant for a year. And then if it hasn't worked, they will look at other fertility treatments to try and produce the pregnancy. Okay. Now, what this lesbian couple was saying, they were saying this is discrimination, because this year of trying to have a baby, as lesbians, that costs us a lot of money for the for the donor sperm, for the artificial insemination. So this costs a lot of money before we can get to the IVF. So she's saying this is like a tax on being a lesbian. This is completely unfair. And so the NHS should pay for those things in order to produce equality. I mean, what do you make of that? What do you make of that? I was on the BBC website, just presented as common sense position, no counter argument, etc. Right, let's see what else we've got on here. The sex education is, they call it comprehensive sex education, and it is from the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Now, I'm sometimes a bit cautious to point, well, not cautious. I mean, my fear is that people fit that into a broader conspiracy theory of the United Nations controlling all sorts of things, etc. So let's keep it in perspective, but it is a fact that so-called comprehensive sex education is imposed pretty well by the United Nations and the World Health Organization. So you can see the same issues arising in nations around the world. So yes, very definitely. Right. Okay, let's see. Right, what other issues have been in the news? Right, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's something I've talked about a few times, but that's been in the news again. I'll just recap what's happened. Let's start from the beginning. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child includes a lot of really important rights for children, like you're not allowed to torture them, you can't make them be soldiers, you can't deprive them of their citizenhood, you can't separate from their families, you can't take away their name, for example, deprive them of contact and knowledge of their family. I mean, there's all sorts of rights in there. They're really important. Right to healthcare, education. I mean, a right to healthcare and education doesn't actually help you much. It's healthcare and education that you actually want, not a right to it. But anyway, what were the content of the rights? It's pretty straightforward stuff, quite noble aims, but generally completely irrelevant in Scotland, because these things, children are not really in danger of these things, apart from in a tiny, tiny minority of cases. But what happens with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is the United Nations interprets it to mean whatever it wants it to mean. So, for example, the right to life means that a country has to allow abortion, for example. I'm not making that up. That is exactly what they mean. So they interpret them to mean a sort of left-leaning, progressive, secular ideology. They interpret them in that light and then expect countries to do the same. So the SNP love the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child because basically it's interpreted in a way that reinforces everything that the SNP wants to do. I mean, another major theme in it is that it undermines parental authority, again, which is a major theme in the SNP's recent history, is it not? A named person scheme, etc. So the more rights are given to children, that's basically undermining the rights and authority of parents. And instead of parents having authority over the children, professionals replace them. So the children's rights movement is a way of pushing parents, driving a wedge between children and their parents, pushing parents out a little bit and bringing professionals in instead. So instead of the parents being able to advise and guide a child, the parents are pushed out and the child can make their own decisions with the professionals employed by the government alongside them to help them make the right decision as the government sees it. So that's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It should be a big controversy. I mean, for example, the UNCRC says that nations have to have a smacking ban. It says that the way it's interpreted is that you have to have hate speech legislation. So you see the SNP think, oh, this is wonderful. This is just the UN tells us what to do. And what they tell us to do is what we want to do in any case. So we'll take the UNCRC and we'll make it part of Scots law. So that's what they tried to do. But then it ran into legal difficulties at the UK Supreme Court. And they said, you can't do that because it's not within your devolved competence because it would affect decisions of the UK government as well. So you can't do it. £200,000 was spent, half from the Scottish government, half from the UK government to try and sort this out. But it's ended up being blocked. Now, the point I want to make is it's just amazing that in Scotland, the only way this issue has been looked at, the only lens through which it's been viewed in the media and political establishment is through the Constitution. So the SNP is saying, look, Scotland needs to be independent because we can't protect children's rights. If we were independent, we could protect children's rights. Then you've got the Conservatives saying, look, the SNP are just playing games with this. They deliberately did this, knowing full well it was going to fall in the courts. Then they could play it as a grievance and use it as a case for independence. But to be honest, I don't believe the Conservatives. I don't think the SNP are that clever. I don't think they formulated this thing, took it right through the Parliament, with actually knowing it was going to run into legal difficulties. I don't think that was the plan. I think it just happened unexpectedly. But if the Conservatives thought it was the plan, why were they not pointing it out while it was going through the Parliament? So we've got legislation here that really is anti-family, anti-parents, and is going to be harmful to children. And the only debate the Scottish media and political establishment can conjure up about it is about the Constitution. The actual content of it, the actual crucial issues, nowhere to be seen. In fact, I'm maybe not quite right to say I'm the only person I've heard speaking about this. Maybe I've heard other people talking about this issue as well. I can't think of any off the top of my head. But that is the situation we're in. I've heard it called Ulsterization of politics. When you get a constitutional issue that sort of overwhelms all others, and every other issue can only be seen through the lens of the Constitution. And that's what's happened with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Is it timidity because of an atmosphere of fear of criticising the government? I think that's the case in a lot of things in Scotland. But I think with the UNCRC, it's a case of, for example, the Conservative Party being completely oblivious to the issues involved, completely oblivious. Now, with the UNCRC, I first started hearing about this, years and years ago, when I was teaching. And I started thinking, I'm not sure about this. There's something here that doesn't quite sit right. I'm a bit uncomfortable with this. And so what I did is put some effort in, read some books, order a couple of textbooks from Amazon, look into it and try and see what it's all about. And then I came to the conclusion that I've explained to you. And I'm not alone in that. That's just like not sort of wacky old me come up with this homespun theory. That's a mainstream criticism of United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. So if you get the textbook from Oxford University Press, which I can't show myself just now, but there's a section in that says children's rights are often criticized for undermining the rights of parents and replacing parents with professionals. So that's mainstream criticism of it. But no one, it appears to me, no one in the Scottish Parliament has made the effort to look into this issue and actually mount any sort of intelligent opposition to it. So fear of criticizing the government is often a factor, but in this case, I think it's just lack of critical thinking and awareness of the issues. So anyway, let's have a look. Okay. So the decent parents can do remedial counselling of their children. That's a good point. But of course, this whole ethos makes that more difficult because the children are taught basically no one's got the right to tell you what to do. Everything should be democratic. So that puts a tension in family relationships from the very beginning. So I would say to parents, if you're finding that your children, teenagers, whatever, if they're being difficult, if they've been very disobedient, quite obstinate, stubborn, and when you tell them what to do, the reaction is sort of, who on earth do you think you are to tell me that I'm not allowed to do something? Whatever thinks you've got the right to do that. If you feel that's the reaction you're getting from your children, the first thing I would say is, 'twas ever thus. Okay, I mean, that's just part of human nature. That's part of bringing up children. But I would also say that it might well be the case that the way children are taught about children's rights at school might be contributing to that. So that is, a very valid issue. Right, home education is an interesting topic. Decent parents should really remove their kids and homeschool them. Apparently, a lot of home educators don't like the term homeschooling. I can sort of see why, because they're not trying to simulate a school at home. It's education. I know a lot of people have done that. I've had a lot of messages recently of parents saying that they've just had enough with the state system. They're just going to teach their children at home. Some of that's come through the lockdown because they've had more insight into the content of the curriculum because the children have been working at home. So parents have seen what they've been doing. And that's what's happened in America. Was it West Virginia governorship? I can't remember the details, but there's a recent election in America where the Republicans got in completely against the run of play, overturning a massive majority at the presidential election. And part of the reason was parental revolt over the sort of progressive indoctrination that parents became aware of through the children working at home during lockdown. And it became a major political issue. So may be one here too. In terms of home education, it's difficult. The younger the children are, I suppose, the easier it is in terms of the content of the education. It's a big time commitment. As children get older, providing the subject-specific instruction becomes more difficult. But a model that's taking off, I think, to some degree in Scotland as well, is the idea where you have a church and they decide they want to run a Christian school. And the way they do it, roughly speaking, is they might say employ one person to run it. Then you might have, say, 20 kids. And the parents of those kids are on a rota. So, Fred's mum comes on Monday afternoon and does art. Bill's dad comes in on a Tuesday morning for an hour or two and they do sport. So people come in, they share their expertise with it. If you're someone who doesn't have a particular academic subject, you can teach one. There's lots of other things you can do in a school as well. So they staff a school through volunteers with maybe just a little bit of professional input. And it seems to work very well. I mean, these schools like this have existed in the United States for a long time, but I'd say they seem to be developing in Scotland as well. In response to this, it's not just Christians as well. People of other faiths are very concerned about what's going on in education and are looking for alternatives. Now, with home education, people say there's the socialization issue. I mean, to be honest, I've met a lot of home educated children. I don't really think that is an issue. You can do your education at home and still have a perfectly adequate social life as well. So I don't really buy that. Before we leave this issue, I'll just outline family party policy. We want to be very supportive of home educating parents, so we certainly won't be banning it. I'm surprised there's not been moves to ban it already in Scotland. Surely the Greens must be thinking that they want to ban it because they want everyone educating in the one true truth, which is the Green Party manifesto. The SNP have got a very similar view, not quite so extreme, but pretty similar. The countries that the SNP admire, Scandinavian countries in particular, in some of those, home education is illegal. It's illegal in Germany as well. There was a story a couple of years ago where a family wanted to home educate their children. So the authorities came down on them and said, you're not allowed to do that. So the family tried to leave the country permanently. They wanted to emigrate to go and live somewhere else where they could home educate. And they were arrested at the airport and prosecuted for home educating their children. So I'm surprised that hasn't happened already in Scotland. But any day now, I could expect that some people will become, that the Greens and the SNP will come forward and be saying they want to ban home education. Maybe the reason why they don't is this. There's two sorts of home educators, very roughly speaking. Two sorts of home educators. Type number one are the sort of evangelical Christians, Catholics as well. So Christians, basically. I suppose you could think, some Muslim families as well. You'd put in that sort of socially conservative grouping. But then the other type of home educators are the sort of knitted wool yogurt, organic, good life types. Okay, I'm not sure that's the correct technical term. But the sort of people I mean. So there's that type as well. Now, maybe the Green Party is a bit reluctant to upset that type of people. So maybe that's what's keeping it off the agenda at the moment. But to finish off with the family party's policy, so we want to be very supportive. So home educating parents could partake of the facilities at a local school as they wished. If they wanted to use the library, if they wanted to borrow the science equipment, if they wanted their children to go into school to do the tests, if there were a system of tests going on, then they could do the work at home, go and do the test at school, see how they're doing, then carry on working at home. So basically, and also they could go in for certain parts of the school week. So, for example, if the school did proper work in the morning, then did all sorts of sort of wishy-washy nonsense in the afternoon. Then if parents wanted to say, right, they'll come in for the morning, they'll do maths, English, history, and geography or whatever in the morning. But in the afternoon, you're doing personal and social health education and all sorts of other things. So we don't want them to come in for that. We just want them in the morning. Then the school should make every effort to facilitate that. That's got a special name, actually. What do they call it? Flexi schooling. That's it. So our policy would be to support that. So we're very much on side for home educating parents, and we want to help them as much as possible. Now, the next step with that, of course, would be financial assistance. That's quite difficult to implement. And once you sort of have a payment there, then that's quite controversial. There's a lot of dynamics to consider. But certainly we want to be very supportive of home educating parents. Right, let's have a look at a few more comments. Right, brainwashing factories. Okay, that's as strongly as you could word it, but certainly indoctrination is going on an industrial scale. I suppose that's what you mean by factories. Children should be taught how to think, not what to think. That is absolutely correct. Family party policy is that schools should cut out all the sort of political, ideological content. Cut it out completely. All the equality, diversity, inclusion, and equity, all that sort of stuff. Cut it all out. And instead, have lessons in critical thinking. So teach people how to think, to recognize a logical argument, to recognize a fallacy in an argument. Now, I've got a book by Steven Pinker, well, an audio book that I haven't actually listened to yet. So I'll talk about it when I've listened to it. But his basic thesis is that whatever someone's sort of natural IQ level, if you like, they can function more rationally by being taught critical thinking skills. I mean, for example, a really basic one is if you're presented with some data, you'll have a first response to it. You'll think, oh, that's what it shows, right? It shows that that's dangerous. But probably a good thing to do is to think, well, hang on a minute, let's just stop and think. Was my first reaction actually justified? Let's look at this a bit more closely. Now, just that habit of not accepting the first thing that pops into your head and stepping back and thinking, right, I just need to think about this a little bit more. Just that habit, it's like making people cleverer, if you like. It makes people more able to reach rational conclusions about all sorts of things in their life. So that's the sort of education that we want. That's what's in the Family Party Manifesto. The reason we say it should be completely unrelated to contemporary issues is if you allow it to be based on contemporary issues, it would be, find the 3 logical flaws in President Trump's address to Congress. And so you'd have a passage and you'd find the 3 flaws in President Trump's address. Then it could say, point out the strengths of the argument in Joe Biden's address. That's what it'd be. Just the bias would come through all the way through. If it wasn't in the curriculum, it would be in the teacher materials. If it wasn't in the teacher materials, which it would be, it would come through from the teachers. So teaching this critical thinking, it should be completely independent of any political or social issues. They should teach it on some neutral ground so that the pupils can really focus on the principles involved. Right, let's have a look. What if parents aren't able to homeschool for whatever reason? Absolutely. I think for a lot of parents, it just is not practical. It's not practical, and they might not want to as well. It's perfectly reasonable for a parent to say, that's not part of my life plan, to be committing that sort of time to educating my own children. So the main emphasis of our education policies, obviously, is improving state education. That's the priority. But for those who, in the short term, until the Scottish Family Party comes to power and implements our policies, in the short term, they feel that schools are too dangerous, immoral, corrupting, misleading, indoctrinating, whatever, that they feel they don't want their children to be exposed to that, then I think that's a perfectly valid decision. We want to support people in that. But the priority is to change the schools. The other thing that's important to say there is, okay, if you can homeschool your own children to protect them from some of the things going on in the mainstream schools, then that's great for your own children. But we've got a broader vision for that. Our attitude isn't, well, stuff the rest of the children. We don't care about them. If they get, receive messages that might damage their prospects through the rest of their life, we don't really care about that. As long as we've looked after our own children, then that's not helpful. So even to home educators, I would say you still should be concerned about what goes on in schools. It's incredibly arrogant to assume that every parent can do a better job. I don't assume that every parent can do a better job. That's a good point. I mean, will there be some parents who might decide to homeschool who are actually not capable of it, or try and homeschool up to a level that they're not capable of? I guess there's that risk. On the other hand, how many parents would parents normally be able to recognize their limitations? I mean, that is potentially a danger. To be honest, I can't say I've ever heard of a case where children have said, the problem was I was home educated and the expertise wasn't there. I haven't heard of that, but it is a potential issue, so fair enough. Right. They shouldn't be exposed to alternate viewpoints. I assume you're talking about home education there. Parents are perfectly capable of teaching children about different viewpoints. Okay, I wouldn't assume that there's any difficulty. If you think there might be some parents who don't expose their children to alternative viewpoints, well, nor do mainstream schools in an awful lot of cases. But the other question is, even if the parents don't expose the children to a broad range of perspectives, are the children not going to come across them as they're growing up? I mean, they're going to be on the internet. They're going to watch television. They're going to listen to the radio. It's going to come from all directions. We don't need to worry, I think, particularly about young people failing to hear a range of basically the mainstream viewpoints. The issue is whether or not they're going to hear an alternative to them. And I think that's what home educators are often looking for. Right. Just reading some comments here. They're quite long. Right. I haven't quite read all this one. Let's see what it says. Right. Dave. Sorry, Derek. Derek, I don't remember seeing you before. Here. Right. Derek, welcome. This is indicative of the shift from government to governance. Every political party has been rendered completely impotent by the cult of technocracy. The rabbit hole goes deep. The end game is transhumanization. Dehumanization is the side effect we're currently dealing with. Thank you for your courage. Right, okay, I could do a bit more explaining about this. Every political party has been rendered completely impotent by the cult of technocracy. Right, I think by that you mean sort of expert-led policy, that the academic establishment churns out evidence that seems to demand that governments make certain decisions. So there isn't the option, that there isn't the openness to a variety of policy choices, because the range is restricted by an academic establishment. I think that is certainly the case. And I think what tends to happen in universities, I mean, on every subject in universities where there's the opportunity for a political bias, it's there hugely. It completely dominates. So a sort of secular, progressive, often left-leaning worldview will dominate any area in academia where it's got a chance. I mean, it might struggle in maths because there's not really much chance for political influence. But in virtually any other area, that's what happens. So, for example, the people who are doing research into drug deaths or this sort of thing, they're doing it from that perspective. So the research they're producing, the arguments they're producing, tend to reflect that. But because they're the only game in town academically, it tends to be taken as the one true truth and leads government policy. Now, I'll go on to another. Taxpayers foot the bill for Catholic education in Catholic schools. Indeed, they do. And I foot the bill for secular, progressive education in mainstream schools, non-denominational schools as well. Right. I've been volunteering in a primary school for 3 years. I've never seen any of the children be told they can choose their gender if they want to. Haven't you? Okay. Don't believe everything you read. What, like the government's guidance, the government's curriculum, the government's guidance for dealing with transgender pupils, their lesson plans? I'm supposed to not believe them. Well, I do believe them. I do believe them because they're from the government and that's the way the government wants schools to operate. Right. I mean, that's quite true. I said in universities, the bias might struggle in maths. Of course, it doesn't struggle in maths in Scottish schools because the government has produced resources. You've probably seen them in other videos, colour in the rainbow flag, calculate the area of this rainbow flag, etc., etc. So yes, quite right. Yes, maths doesn't escape. Yeah, critical thinking and resilience lessons should replace RMPS lessons content. So that's religious, moral, and philosophical studies. Is that right? RMPS? I think it is. Now, I would say religious education, learning about religions, is a valuable part of education. I'd say it's an important part of education. The fear would be that it's taught in a way that's effectively teaching religious pluralism. In other words, all the religions are the same. Okay, they might dress up in different clothes. They might do their wedding ceremonies slightly different, but they're really all the same underneath. There's just people trying to be good, and also probably they're all not really true. But we'll be respectful to them. That's generally the sort of tone and ethos that comes through a lot of religious education in schools. Not universal, but often that's the case. Critical thinking, very definitely. Now, resilience lessons, that's an interesting one. There are resilience lessons in schools now. By resilience, they mean the ability to bounce back after a setback or disappointment. So if you fail the exam one time, the resilient pupil, instead of being depressed or whatever, they'll say, right, I'm going to get it next time, and they'll bounce back and have another go and hopefully succeed on a subsequent attempt. I tend to think, is that something you can have a lesson about? Or is that something that children should learn naturally through the process of trying things, being challenged, trying difficult things? Sometimes they don't work out. I would be more inclined to think if the school is a challenging and supportive environment, then resilience should develop naturally rather than having to focus on it. My feeling is because schools have become so unchallenging and therapeutic, they've taken away competitive aspects and basically taken away the opportunity to fail. So you can't learn to bounce back. That's why people then think, oh, well, we need resilience lessons then. So I would suggest if schools were operating effectively, I'd suggest that resilience lessons wouldn't be necessary. A lot of these character things, they're best learned through daily interactions with staff and just through the general ethos of the school, rather than trying to teach them explicitly. Okay, right. Bipedal species. I can't quite read that one. Right, Bruce, I agree, Toby. There's an obvious exaggeration what Richard has to say about educational indoctrination. Most of it is hearsay. I know plenty of teachers who've never heard of such teachings. Okay, hearsay. How is looking at the government's policy and the government's resources hearsay? I just don't get that. You'll need to expand on that. Okay, how is it when the government pays an organization to produce educational resources to be used in schools, and I look at them and they describe them as an indoctrination? How is that hearsay? So I'll leave you to have a think about that. Okay. Right, just having a look at these. Secular schools are inclusive for everyone, irrespective of faith. Wrong. Depends what you mean by a secular school. If you mean a school that's somehow neutral on all these controversial issues, is that possible even? You could have a school that just taught academic subjects without bringing any bias into them, any particular philosophical perspective. Is that even possible? I mean, this is generally the secular fallacy. I think it's quite often called. The secular fallacy is that the secular, humanist, progressive, liberal view is somehow neutral. So if you have a Christian school, well, that's very specific. But a secular, progressive, liberal school, well, that's neutral. That's a school for everyone. No, it's not. Right, let's keep going. Okay, a few comments about transhumanism. Quite a few of them I would be interested to explore more. For those of you for whom that might be a new concept, the idea of transhumanism is sort of technical enhancements to human bodies. So using medical type science, but not to eliminate problems, not to solve problems or malfunctions in the way that health care does, but to enhance. So, for example, if it came to the eyes, it wouldn't be trying to correct a vision defect, but to do something that would enable people to see better than people normally can see. Or, for example, with the brain, to try and do something, to add something to the brain that's going to enable it to think better. I think the progress in this area is often exaggerated because it's quite exciting, science fiction-y. We'll get a media splash with it. I think the actual solid progress is a lot more limited than the hype. But it's a very interesting philosophical issue. Right. The government's policy is not being read to school children. The government's policy number. The government produces lesson plans, educational resources, and says, this is what we recommend to be used in schools, and they amount to indoctrination. Right. Okay. Okay. I think that's quite apparent what's going on there. Right. We've got how long? We've got 10 minutes. I've got another issue to move on to. Let's just see if anything's coming up here. Okay. Recommended. Okay, so if the government only recommends indoctrination, that's okay. Is it? I mean, they're clutching at straws here, I think. Clutching at straws. Right, the last issue I was going to talk about. Yeah. Right, this is the last issue I was going to talk about. This is the Scottish Government's new public information campaign about alcoholism and drug addiction. Now, when I said those words, alcoholism and drug addiction, I assume you all thought, what a horrible person he is. He's so unsympathetic. He's just projecting stigma onto these people by calling them drug addicts and alcoholics. But that's basically the theme of the Scottish Government's campaign. So these are some of the posters. You'll see them around bus shelters, etc., before too long, I would imagine. So let's read some of what's going on here. The Scottish Government campaign aims to highlight the damage caused by the stigma of problem drug and alcohol use and how this can stop those affected from being able to get help. Okay, do you think stigma stops alcoholics and drug addicts getting help? So let's say, for example, you're an alcoholic and you're going to go to some sort of support group, which will be confidential, obviously. You feel stigma prevents you from going there, to go and be with people who specialize in dealing with that issue, maybe people who are also going through the same experience. Would stigma prevent you from going? What about if you're going to go to some health service offering help for people with a drug problem? Would stigma stop you from going? I really don't think so. What we've got here is a sort of inversion of reality. Anyway, I'll carry on. I'll read a bit more of it. Just from the government, people struggling with alcohol or drug problems should get the same support and treatment as those with any other health condition. Well, yes, of course. I mean, does anyone disagree with that? Has anyone ever disagreed with that in Scotland? I mean, that's just obvious. But then it goes on. Substance use has been seen as a lifestyle choice or the result of poor decisions. It's also been described or viewed as a mistake or a result of moral weakness. This is stigmatizing and unhelpful. This is mad, isn't it? It's just an inversion of reality. If someone chooses to take dangerous illegal drugs, have they made a poor decision? The Scottish Government says no, they have not made a poor decision. Don't you dare say they've made a poor decision. If you say they've made a mistake in starting to take dangerous illegal drugs, then you're stigmatizing them and you're being unhelpful. You're being a bad person. So we need to run a poster campaign to turn you into the sort of good person who says, no, starting to take illegal drugs, that wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mistake at all. If it wasn't a mistake, it was a perfectly good decision, I assume. Is that what we have to say? Perfectly valid choice? Perfectly acceptable? I really don't know. Because if you've got this sort of, results of poor decisions viewed as a mistake or result of moral weakness. Well, I would say in some cases with drugs, absolutely. When a teenager might be tempted to take an illegal drug, I believe their conscience would be saying, you should not do this. You should not do it. For your own sake and for the sake of your family and wider society. This is something you ought not do. But the teenager might do it in any case. Is that a sign of moral weakness? Well, yes. Yes, it is. I mean, I'm not saying, there's some people who are morally weak and some who are not. I mean, I mean, who knows? Who knows what each of us would have done in various situations we might have found ourselves in. But for that person in that particular situation, that was a sign of moral weakness. I mean, probably, if you're thinking, oh, yeah, what a terrible person, I mean, can you resist a packet of biscuits when it's left out every time? Well, not necessarily. So it can be difficult to resist, but it is a sign of moral weakness, and it is a mistake. So it says the problem with people like me who think choosing to take dangerous illegal drugs is a mistake, they say this allows substance use to be linked to character or morals. Viewing this as just a personal issue adds to the stigma. Now, I've heard people on the radio, when they're talking about decriminalization, they talk about people who've come into contact with drugs, just like they've come into contact with coronavirus. They were just walking along to the street and some like drugs stuck to them somehow. Nothing to do with their personal decisions at all. And certainly nothing moral. I mean, it's a case of demoralization. Demoralization, not in the sense of like making you miserable and discouraged and give up, whatever, but demoralization in the sense of taking away the moral element that clearly should be there. Right, the government goes on to say, calls on people to help challenge stigma by speaking out when they hear negative or wrong comments about people with a drug or alcohol problem. It advises that terms such as addict, alcoholic, and junkie. Okay, junkie is probably a derogatory term, but drug addict, alcoholic, they just sound perfectly descriptive to me, should not be used, but replaced with person with problematic substance use, person with harmful alcohol use, or person with problematic drug use. I mean, for a start, you're replacing a very short phrase with something like 2 or 3 times as long. So that's basically not going to get used. So they think if you can just change the language, it will take away the stigma, and then being a drug addict will become perfectly respectable and accepted in society, which would naturally be a positive thing. We don't want drug addiction. We don't want that life to be regarded as valid and acceptable and perfectly equal to other lifestyles, other life experiences that people have. It's a problem. It's something we want to steer people away from because it's a bad thing. Okay, and people who go down that path have made a mistake. Now, they might have made that mistake in the most difficult of circumstances, where you can quite understand how that happened. Okay, you'd have every sympathy with them, but still ultimately it is a mistake. I mean, changing those words, this is often something you get from the progressive side of the political spectrum. The idea that you've got to change the words because a word has a negative connotation. So use a different word and then it won't have a negative connotation anymore and the problem's solved. I mean, the classic case was like people used to be referred to as crippled, which I think at the time was not a derogatory term. It was just descriptive. But people said, no, that's regarded as negative. So let's say handicapped. And again, eventually that was seen as a bit derogatory. Then it was disabled. Then it was differently abled, etc. So you see, they keep changing the word, thinking that if you change the word, being disabled is not going to be seen as a negative thing anymore. But at the end of the day, being disabled, in a sense, is negative. I mean, it restricts someone's capabilities in some way or another. It's not something that most people would choose. It's not regarded as a positive thing. But changing the word isn't going to change this. So same with here. You can call drug addicts what you like, but still a drug addict is a drug addict. It's someone whose life basically is in a mess. Someone who needs to make the decision themselves to try and sort themselves out and might need an awful lot of support to do that. But not calling them a drug addict, calling them a person with problematic drug use, is that going to make all the difference? So what they're trying to do is shift the blame. They say the blame it's absolutely nothing to do with the individual who's made bad decisions. It's not their fault at all. The real harm is done. The real damage is caused by people with the wrong attitude, people who cause the stigma. So it's people like me who use the term drug addicts, say choosing to take dangerous illegal drugs is wrong and it's a mistake. So all the drug deaths in Scotland, as far as the Scottish governments are concerned, it's really my fault. It's not the people who choose to take drugs, it's not drug dealers. It's my fault for having the wrong attitude to it. But just to finish on a slightly lighter note, on this idea of sort of euphemisms, keeping changing the terminology. Now, in schools, they used to talk about some pupils being retarded. Then it would be remedial class. Then it would be additional needs, then special needs. But what's happened now is they've used the word special so much that if you've heard young people talking, they now use it as a joke. The word special is used as a joke. So if someone's doing something and they're really, really bad at it, and they want to make a joke about how bad they are at it, they'll say, I'm special at this, aren't I? And if they're talking about someone else who really is, not very good at something, really can't do something, they might say, oh, that they're a bit special, aren't they? So you can change the word and change the word as much as you like. It doesn't change the fact that the thing being referred to is what it is, and it's not a positive thing in the end of the day. Right. Anyway, right. Thank you very much for your comments. I've enjoyed reading those. The transhumanism thing, I'd like to talk about that another time. We'll maybe try and get someone on the live stream. Just to talk about the live stream next week, there's going to be a few of us on from the family party. We'll have a Christmas special, a bit of fun and games there. Then we're going to have a Christmas break. And after Christmas, our list of people to invite is enormous. So we've got all sorts of interesting people we're going to have lined up after Christmas. So I'm looking forward to seeing them. But in the meantime, I will wish you good night, and thanks for watching, and thanks for your comments. Thanks for watching as well if you're watching online later. So good night, everyone.